Hey everybody, this is a follow-up to a review I did several years ago of a relatively obscure French first-person shooter by the name of Iron Storm. It also went by World War Zero because that was the PlayStation 2 port. Except it wasn't just on PS2, as I found out much later on. Apparently it got ported over to PC and released in Europe. Eventually they did release it on Steam, however. This was after I did my video, actually a few years after I did the video, if I remember correctly. And thus we have an opportunity to take a look at the port World War Zero, because as I was told many times in the comments of my Iron Storm review, oh, World War Zero is way better than Iron Storm. It's so much better. World War Zero is actually really good. And I'm not entirely sure what it was that ultimately made me pick up a copy of World War Zero on Steam and say, you know what, I'll give it a try and see if it is actually any better. Because I knew for a fact that Iron Storm is absolutely terrible and that nobody in their right mind should play it. So why would a port that went to PS2 and then back to PC actually be any good? Well, there is always the really odd off chance that you end up with something like, say, 007 Nightfire, where the PC and console versions are basically completely different games, and the console version is far superior to the PC version, which is a really weird thing to say about a first-person shooter, but that is the case with Nightfire. So I went ahead and booted up World War Zero to see if it is actually any better than the original PC game Iron Storm. After all, if it's a different enough game, then it might actually deserve a review all on its own. Well, I think you can tell by the fact that this video is not a full-on review of World War Zero on its own, that this is not worth reviewing on its own. Because it's the same game, but more condensed, with a movement speed roughly equivalent to that of a snail on diazepam, and enemies so ridiculously stupid that they make sacks of hammers seem like geniuses by comparison. And at first, I was legitimately baffled as to why anyone would get anything at all out of this game other than its premise, because the premise, like in the original Iron Storm, was a bit dumb but was still kinda neat. The idea is that World War I never ended, and by the time the game takes place in 1964, you have a sort of stalemate between the Russo-Mongolian Empire and the Western Coalition. If handled properly, that sort of premise could create a pretty interesting setting. But it wasn't handled properly. In fact, there's barely any story at all in the original PC Iron Storm, and World War Zero is a condensed version of that. There is somehow even less story in World War Zero than there is in Iron Storm, which I didn't think was really possible considering that there basically wasn't a story in Iron Storm. But here we are. This somehow has even less than that, and the gameplay is so much more boring. Because with incredibly stupid enemy AI, they basically pose no threat to you. They have basically no damage resistance, so a few bullets from just about any of your guns and they'll drop like a sack of potatoes. And even when the game throws you up against tanks and helicopters and such, they're incredibly easy to take down, and even they barely do any damage to you. The only things that will actually reliably do damage to you are turrets, which are really easy to avoid except in certain very specific areas, or explosive weapons, whether it be enemies with grenades or rocket launchers or tanks or whatever the case may be. And even they don't do that much damage to you, and medkits are so plentiful throughout the game that you're never going to need to worry about it. The end result is a game that is so sluggish and boring that it makes it feel like it drags on for way longer than it actually does. Because it feels like it takes about as long, if not even longer, than the original Iron Storm. And yet it's actually about half as long. The original Iron Storm was about 4 to 6 hours to complete, depending on your difficulty and how many times you had to reload saves and such like that. World War Zero, on the other hand, is 2 hours long, and you are not going to be getting any replay value out of it whatsoever. It is campaign only, there's no multiplayer. There was at least multiplayer in Iron Storm, but there's not in World War Zero. Not that you can play Iron Storm multiplayer these days anyway, but that's beside the point. What you actually get with World War Zero is not what these fans of the game told told me, not a much better Iron Storm. In reality, it is a much worse Iron Storm, because at least Iron Storm was irritating. You can work with a game being irritating, at least you're feeling something out of it. With boring games, you just get absolutely nothing out of them. So where would that put World War Zero on my scale compared to Iron Storm? Well, it's not so much worse than Iron Storm that it falls even further down the scale, but it's not any better than Iron Storm either, so it just stays in the same exact category. Which, if you haven't seen my review of Iron Storm, is a 1 out of 5. It was a terrible game. And so's World War Zero. But if the game is so terrible, then why did so many people recommend it to me and say it's a much better game than Iron Storm? Is it just because these people have absolutely no taste in first-person shooters? No, not necessarily. Although I'm sure a few of them probably do. No, it's really just down to nostalgia. And that is something you will see with a lot of games, especially from the mid to late 90s on through about 2010 or so. Among the younger demographics, you'll see a lot higher tolerance for crappiness in video games, and thus they won't necessarily remember that crappiness once they get much older. They'll only remember the good times that they had with a particular game. Maybe they didn't necessarily have access to better games. Maybe they just had access to a small number of pretty crappy games, but because they were playing them with friends, or they were just at a time when things were a lot simpler, they look back on those games fondly. And there's really nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being nostalgic. The problem is when that nostalgia blinds you to the truth. There are certainly plenty of older games that hold up perfectly fine, and some of them have basically aged like fine wine. If you go back and play the original Doom and Doom 2, for example, they still hold up extremely well. But games like that are the exception rather than the norm. Most games fall into one of two categories. Either they are very much a product of their time, and if you view them in that context, then they are still fine for their time, but they don't hold up as well, or they weren't even good at the time, and they definitely don't hold up all these years later. I mean, think about it this way. Iron Storm released in 2002 for PC, and then World War Zero was released in 2004 for PS2 and 2005 for PC. This means that Iron Storm came out the same year as Soldier of Fortune 2, No One Lives Forever 2, Jedi Outcast, Medal of Honor Allied Assault, 007 Nightfire. There were quite a few rather impressive games that released that year, and it gets even more ridiculous once you move to World War Zero, where the PS2 version of the game released the same year we got Half-Life 2 and Doom 3 and Far Cry, among other things, and with the PC version releasing the following year, that made it a contemporary with games like Fear, so it just wasn't even remotely a contest there. There is absolutely no metric by which Iron Storm and World War Zero hold up all these years later, and they never held up to begin with. They were always crappy games. But if all you have access to are crappy games, then you're probably going to consider any game better than nothing. And if that's the kind of situation you're in, then admittedly that's kind of sad, but at the same time, it's completely understandable. But that's going to feed into your personal bias about the game, and you're going to need to acknowledge that when it comes time to critically examine it. But that's not something most people are able or even willing to do, because it's just so much easier to look back on the past, at times when things were much simpler for you personally, and remember things as being much better than they actually are. And while those feelings might be comforting to you, and that is perfectly fine if that's what you're going for, that's not helpful to other people who don't have that nostalgia for these things. That's why taking a step back and performing a critical assessment is incredibly important. If you don't do that, then you're not able to give a solid recommendation for or against something. All you're able to do is go off of your entirely subjective feelings. And especially in the case of those feelings being based on things that you experienced, say, a decade, 2 decades, even longer than that ago, those feelings are going to be completely detached from the current reality. And while sure, it's important to keep in mind the context of when something was released and what the standards were at the time and such like that, it is infinitely more important to assess that thing for what it is, not for what you think it is. That's where you're gonna trip up if you have nostalgia for something. You need to be able to separate your personal feelings from what the thing actually is, and most people are not able or willing to do that. Hence situations like what you see on my videos all the time, where I'll review something that came out several years ago, and somebody who's nostalgic for that game goes on that video expecting me to shower the game in glowing praise, only to find out that I am heavily criticizing it and pointing out that it was actually an absolute mess even when it came out. And then they will take to the comments and angrily write out a response that I'm biased, or that I'm full of crap, or that the game was actually really good and I just can't understand it, or that I'm criticizing something purely to spite the fan base, and that nobody should listen to what I have to say, and so on and so forth. But here's the thing. If you've already played through a game, if you already have nostalgia for a game, my videos aren't made for you. My videos are made for the general audience, the people who may never have even heard of this particular game. Maybe they discovered this game on a Steam sale and they think it might be interesting, but they're not entirely sure, so they look up a few reviews. Or maybe they're looking up games that are similar to ones they do like, but they want to be really certain about what they're getting into, so they look up reviews. That's really the kind of thing that reviews are targeted towards. It's to help people make sound purchasing decisions instead of wasting their money on crappy games. And while in the case of those older games that still hold up, those nostalgic feelings are probably going to line up fairly well with what the reviewer's saying, it's not gonna happen with a game that wasn't very good when it came out or was outright crap when it came out, but you have those nostalgic feelings for. So just keep that in mind next time you watch one of these reviews of older games that you played a long time ago, because it is all too easy to fall into the nostalgia trap. You will see it time and time again with older games, and as newer generations of gamers get older, you're going to be seeing it with more and more games. Again, it's perfectly fine if you're nostalgic for something. Just don't let it blind you to reality. And so let's bring it all back to what started this video off in the first place. World War Z, a game that a lot of people apparently have quite a lot of nostalgia for. It was never a good game. It was never even an acceptable game. It was always a downright awful first-person shooter. It was really never worth playing in the first place, and certainly all these years later, it's definitely not worth your time or money. But apparently some people were able to enjoy it a long time ago, when they didn't have very many responsibilities, if they had any at all, and when they maybe didn't have access to anything else. But these days, you can do a hell of a lot better than World War Z and Iron Storm. Thanks for watching.